Kierkegaard and the Question of the Press actually is an updated title. In Reclaiming Conversation, the Power of Talk in a Digital Age, sociologist Sherry Turkle argues that the relentlessly mediated character of modern communication has gotten us into trouble. The problem is that we now prefer to relate to one another through our computers and phones rather than in face-to-face interaction. Quote, "We hide from each other even as we're constantly connected to each other." The nature of this hiding is multifaceted. On the one hand, screens allow us to easily cast our bodies aside and to present ourselves as we would like to be. Thus, our social interactions are superficial and often narcissistic. On the other hand, with fewer tangible relationships, we are less capable of developing our own sense of identity. The digital self is a constructed self, capable of perpetual self-invention, and yet numbed by a constant feed of connection, information, and entertainment. In short, what would seem to be a good, an abundance of communication and amusement, has become a source of alienation, both personal and interpersonal. We are forever elsewhere, Turkle declares. Turkle wrote her book for the seriousness of our moment, but the truth is that her concerns are not new. Critiques of mass culture go back to the reflections on modern life and leisure that began appearing in the 16th century during the demise of feudalism. As society industrialized, urbanized, and democratized, there was an evolution in societal expectations and habits, one of which was a newfound need for diversion. Hence, by the turn of the 19th century, popular entertainment and journalism were criticized as major means of diversion and escape. Søren Kierkegaard was one of the most incisive early critics of mass media, and the overarching aim of this paper is to introduce this aspect of his oeuvre. I will do so in three ways. First, I will tend to his concerns about media anonymity, which stem from the 1830s. Second, I will survey his 1846 book, A Literary Review, which offers a systematic critique of the press. In both cases, it will be seen that for Kierkegaard, the press is dangerous just to the extent that it creates an abstract, disembodied, and disinhibited socio-political culture. Finally, I'll touch on a few Kierkegaardian strategies for coping with today's digital age, a period in which people are confronted by the media and its resultant challenges more than ever before. 1. Kierkegaard's early criticism of the press. In November 1835, Kierkegaard lectured to the student union at the University of Copenhagen. Titled Our Journalistic Literature, his paper sought to analyze the nature and influence of Denmark's burgeoning print media. With regard to the former, Kierkegaard argues that journalism is characterized by, quote, instability in an absence of unity. He says it is like an interstellar cloud in which the, quote, harmony of forces has not taken place yet, nor the rotation on the axis either. This imbalance, in turn, mars the press's defense of liberalism. Advocates for political change should be sincere, grounding their protests in an ethical worldview. In contrast, the popular press couches its criticism in notes and footnotes, in questions and exclamation marks, and its authors are often anonymous. This dishonesty limits the press's political efficacy since, quote, hardly anyone wants to appear before a secret court. I think about our YouTube sort of comment sections, right? On the surface, then, it would seem that liberal papers are unable to guide or to mold society. But Kierkegaard claims that an organ of instability and disunity can actually have a negative influence. Rather than bringing people together over a common goal or principle, it can disrupt them through commotion and distraction. He compares the activism of Danish newspapers to that of Don Quixote. They chase stories that in reality are just windmills. This skittishness leads to a society whose, quote, nervousness is something very harmful. People are busier and more engaged than ever before, but they lack the calm circumspection needed to live well. This circumspection requires an ordering idea, whereas modern society is marked by an incoherent formal striving. With this in mind, Kierkegaard compares the violence of Robespierre's reign of terror to the, quote, nitpicking irritation, end quote, found in the press. Both confuse clamorous hostility with progress. Kierkegaard continued to develop his critique of the press in 1836 when he issued 3 short essays on the subject. These writings share 2 common themes. First, they are marked by consistent concern about media anonymity, The trouble with journalists is that they will not step forward so that one can see with whom one has to do. This anonymity is fine for a novel or a poem, but it is puerile and vain to try to effect political change anonymously. Kierkegaard goes on to contrast the popular media's anonymous reformers with history's great figures, from Moses to Luther to an O'Connell, each of whom refused to stay in the background. His point is clear. True reform happens when one is willing to venture one's life for the sake of a given cause. Hence, to the extent that the press offers criticism behind a veil of anonymity, it is rather a parody of a reforming endeavor. Second, Kierkegaard contends that the print media tends to publish works that lack sophistication. Too much journalism adopts a, quote, swagger-booted, high tragic posture, he says, bemoaning previous historical eras in order to cast the present in a more favorable light. But this tactic is fallacious, since the present must be committed to learn from the past. Kierkegaard says, I certainly know that it goes with states as it does with individuals, and that an individual who has never been any good at anything is always in a terrible hurry to rush into the future. This problem is compounded by the very nature of the medium. The purpose of the press is to manufacture interest, and thus it prefers haste and sensationalism to patience and accuracy, always moving on to the next story at the expense of what he calls retrospection. Apologists for the press write off such inadequacies as the price for greater information, while they excoriate the errors of previous generations. In this way, argues Kierkegaard, they have allowed their own habits and tendencies to cloud both their evaluation of other epochs as well as their own self-understanding. In sum, this early period launched a number of themes that would come to characterize Kierkegaard's authorship. One, that a free press, just to the extent that it lacks a common idea, is bound to bring about a society centered on denial or dissent. Two, that a free press, since it provides a forum for anonymous opinions and caters to an abstract public, depersonalizes cultural life and leads to the diminution of individual accountability and action. And three, that a free press is a popular and indeed commercial medium, prioritizes flair and notoriety over depth and discussion. These insights anticipate a literary review in a number of ways, though as will be seen, the latter text managed to synthesize Kierkegaard's insights into a more coherent analysis. 2, a literary review. Kierkegaard uses Thomasine Gulenberg's novel Two Ages, 1845, as the occasion for a literary review. The novel chronicles a pair of historical time periods, the revolutionary 1790s and the bourgeois 1840s. Kierkegaard began reviewing Two Ages in December of 1845, and he intensified his efforts in the wake of his literary feud with the Corsair, a popular satirical newspaper, which is a bit like The Onion, for those who know that piece of journalism. The aptly named A Literary Review appeared in March 1846. Much of A Literary Review is a close reading of Gulenberg's novel, but the final part of the book, The Results of Observing the Two Ages, is an ethical, philosophical evaluation in which Kierkegaard contrasts the two historical periods featured in the novel. On the one hand is the age of revolution, which is essentially passionate, and therefore, says Kierkegaard, essentially has form. On the other hand is the present age, which Kierkegaard defines as a, quote, it's a long definition, sensible, reflecting age, devoid of passion, flaring up in superficial, short-lived enthusiasm, and prudentially relaxing in indolence, end quote. Crucially, Kierkegaard believes that the present age emerges out of the political cum technological conditions of bourgeois society, especially the popular press. This position is best understood in relation to Kierkegaard's sociological theory. He argues that just as members of a musical ensemble play the same song in a particular way, so in an optimal society, do people relate to the same idea as concrete individuals. But the press obviates this social harmony. This is because the press is a, quote, abstraction. The term abstract is derived from the Latin verb abstrahere, which can be translated as to draw away. To say that the press is abstract, then, is to say that it is disconnected from actual social relations. There is not a flesh and blood person named the press, with whom one can converse or to whom one can give something. That is why the views espoused in the press are deceptive. Though they may be attributed to a person, they are not, sensu stricto, the views of a concrete individual. The medium of the printed word, disseminated impersonally and vastly, stands between person and thereby supersedes face-to-face interaction. Communication happens, but it is essentially and necessarily a detached form of communication. Hence, if the press were to become a decisive means of human discourse, it would lead to the kind of reflective ennui characteristic of the present age. There are two reasons for this outcome. First, a press-driven society lacks concrete individuality precisely in and through its dedication to mediated interpersonal communication, a phenomenon that Kierkegaard terms, quote, the public, publicum, but describes as an all-encompassing something that is nothing. Kierkegaard insists that the publicum is a product of the press. Quote, only in a passionless but reflective age can this phantom develop with the aid of the press, when the press itself becomes a phantom. Indeed, for Kierkegaard, the public is a concept that simply could not have appeared in antiquity, and it emerges only when there is no strong communal life to give substance to the concretion. This is because individuals now develop their personal ideals and mores in accordance with what the public supposedly thinks or wants, despite the fact that the public is not a people, quote, not a people, not a generation, not one's age, not a congregation, not an association, and not some particular persons, end quote. To join the public is to join nothing, and thus to be nothing or nobody, even though there is comfort in this alliance nonetheless. Qua individual, one may feel insignificant, even meaningless, but the sense of being associated with the public can be intoxicating. Quote, the public is the fairy tale in an age of prudence, leading individuals to fancy themselves greater than kings, Kierkegaard adds. The press also fosters a culture of reflective ennui by its occlusion of a unifying idea. For Kierkegaard, such an idea is necessary if society is to flourish. But the press presents so much information and does so with such rapidity that a unifying idea cannot take root. As a result, the present age is a, quote, dialectical tour de force, which lets everything remain but subtly drains the meaning out of it. Rather than foster commitment to ideals or movements, this tendency, quote, exhausts the interactuality of relations in a tension of reflection that has transformed the whole of existence into an equivocation, end quote. Just as the press dispassionately tenders stories about good and evil, so is the present age morally indifferent. Quote, no one is carried away to great exploits by the good. No one is rushed into outrageous sin by evil. The one is just as good as the other, and yet for that very reason, there is all the more to gossip about, end quote. In this way, people begin to approach issues and even life relationships as bystanders. The citizen does not relate himself in the relation, but is a spectator computing the problem. The upshot is not a bloody revolution, but a tension that innervates life. The social order is debated and doubted, but never overthrown. Eventually, as the press becomes a cultural presupposition, this tension of reflection establishes itself as a principle, and, quote, envy becomes the negatively unifying principle in a passionless and reflective age. Envy indicates the absence of a determinative idea. It counteracts a sense of common purpose, and it undermines those persons, say political or religious leaders, who would promote such a purpose. Kierkegaard terms this process leveling, and it fully emerges when envy no longer has the character to come to a self-awareness of its own significance. In other words, leveling occurs when envy suffuses society, thereby serving to degrade excellence, to minimize it until it is no longer excellence. The techno-cosmopolitan conditions of modernity underlie this situation. Whereas the dialectic of antiquity was oriented to the immanent, the dialectic of the present age is oriented to equality. And its most logical implementation is leveling. In this vacuum of individual excellence, the publicum becomes the new standard of right and wrong. That is why, quote, we compute numbers in connection with the most trivial things, end quote. And this numerical verdict is treated as sacrosanct since, quote, the individual fears reflection's judgment upon him, end quote. In turn, a new form of slavery has appeared. The aristocracy has been overthrown, but the public has taken its place. Kierkegaard compares the public to one of the Roman emperors, quote, an imposing, well-fed figure, suffering from boredom and craving only the sensate titillation of laughter. Like a Nero, the public requires something to while away the time, and so it keeps the press for its amusement. The press, through the press, the public exposes and undercuts persons of distinction and excellence. Kierkegaard is talking about more than the press's defiance of the powers that be. He recognizes that the diminishment of, say, the absolute monarchy is but a symptom of a wider problem, namely the diminishment of individual excellence to court. This expansive understanding of leveling can be seen in Kierkegaard's parable of the jewel. Imagine, he begins, an enthralling treasure lying far out on a thin sheet of ice. In a passionate age, the person courageous enough to retrieve the jewel would return as a hero, a superior one, because her venture would entail genuine risk and thus exceptional bravery. In a reflective age, however, people would employ a trained skater who would approach the thin ice but turn away at the last moment. The onlookers would celebrate the skater's intrepidity, but Kierkegaard adds the habits of the reflective age would undermine her sense of accomplishment. Quote, even at the giddy height of the fanfare and the volley of hurrahs, the celebrators would have shrewd and practical understanding that their hero's exploit was really not all that good, that any one of the participants could have done almost the same thing with a little bit of practice. People want the appearance of courage without actually exhibiting courage. They venerate exceptionality even as they have rendered it meaningless. It would seem that this state of affairs is unpalatable, but Kierkegaard insists that it is amusing, even exciting. Here again, the print media plays a role. Quote, the present age is an age of publicity, the age of miscellaneous announcements. Nothing happens, but still there is instant publicity. Publicity keeps life interesting, giving people the opportunity to pretend that something is going to change, even if they know otherwise. Quote, the age of great and good actions is past. The present age is the age of anticipation. Anticipation encourages public debate, but requires no action. All are given an opportunity to talk, but such talk is an end in itself, void of individual distinction. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip down just a little bit. The present age, then, manifests a symbiosis of forces. Let loose by political and technological reform, the print media propels the leveling process, fashioning an abstract civic space in which the pursuit of individual distinction is subordinated to public opinion. As a result, society is preoccupied with reflection, with discussing what the public wants, and this concern drives the public's interest in the press, not to mention the press's frequent need to keep the public interested. Reflection begets more reflection. It is a cycle of pragmatic tedium made acceptable by advertisements, banquets, gadgetry, gossip, and other forms of entertainment. This form of social organization has its benefits, diminished threat of violent upheaval, greater freedom of expression, etc., but it also bears an immense danger, that persons will mindlessly follow the crowd, relishing the age's material comforts while forgetting the singular importance of their own lives and of human life writ large. 3, by way of conclusion, betrothing as therapy in the information age. Once dubbed the fork for his ability to spear opponents, Kierkegaard was doubtless a master critic, but does he offer any solutions to the present age? To answer this question in full would require far more time than allotted here, so I'll sketch but a couple of responses. First, in contrast to the reflection characteristic of the present age, Kierkegaard recommends a different mode of thinking, namely betrothing or contemplation. Whereas reflection connotes hesitant and skeptical thought, Kierkegaard links contemplation with existential earnestness, alvor. Thus, to practice betrothing is to look at, betrachte, things with an eye to their eternal significance, to attend to what a thing is or shows itself to be rather than to dominate or instrumentalize it. This point leads to another. Since Kierkegaard recognizes that the present age is always already inimical to contemplation, he encourages a detachment from its distractions. This message is implied in various books by Kierkegaard. For example, in What We Learn from the Lilies in the Field and from the Birds of the Air, he urges the reader to take leave of the modern city, to venture out where the lily blooms so beautifully, looking up where the bird is freely at home, precisely because, quote, there is unbroken silence, no one is present there, and everything is sheer persuasion. On the surface, such emphases may seem unrelated to Turkle's concerns about reestablishing the art of conversation in the digital age. Yet for Kierkegaard, only the one who has won the clarity of self-knowledge can truly communicate with others. Turkle agrees, quote, the capacity for solitude is essential to the development of empathy, and this is why solitude marks the beginning of conversation's virtuous circle. If you are comfortable with yourself, you can put yourself in someone else's place, end quote. Hence, in our attempt to understand the culture of the iPhone and Twitter, it may be that the voice of a 19th century Dane merits serious attention. Thank you.